A 7-year-old orphan girl gets off the school bus for the school picnic, desperate because she had promised her classmates that her dad would arrive at any moment. When she sees an elegant man about to get into a luxury car, she runs to him, clasps her hands in supplication and begs, "Mister, can you be my dad at the school picnic? It'll be really quick, please." The man looks at her desperate face, then at the park full of happy families, and his heart tightens. He asks her to wait just 1 minute and drives away, leaving the child in tears, convinced she's been deceived. But what happens when he returns minutes later changes everything. The spring morning sun gently kissed the green leaves of Lincoln Park as the school bus pulled over with a squeal of tired brakes. Among the children who poured out happily, one 7-year-old girl stood out, not for her worn-out clothes or messy hair, but for the forced smile that barely hid the anxiety clenching her chest like a fist. Sophia held her small, torn backpack tightly, watching as the other kids ran toward their waiting parents. Mothers arranged colorful picnic baskets, fathers pushed children on the swings, and the air filled with laughter and cheerful chatter. The smell of cut grass mingled with the aroma of freshly made sandwiches, creating a festive atmosphere that only deepened the pit in her stomach. "My dad will be here any minute," she had promised her teacher, Mrs. Miller, last week when she received the invitation for the school picnic. The words had come so naturally that she'd almost believed her own lie. After all, making up stories was her specialty, a skill developed over the years to make reality more bearable. Mrs. Miller approached with a maternal smile, adjusting her glasses. "Sophia, honey, where's your father? The activities are about to start." The girl's heart hammered. Her small, expressive eyes desperately scanned the park, searching for a miracle. And then she saw him, an elegant man dressed in an impeccable suit, walking toward a luxury car parked on the street. His graying hair was perfectly styled, and even from a distance, he radiated an authority Sophia associated with the successful fathers of her classmates. Without a second thought, she ran. Her small legs moved with an urgency born of pure desperation. The wind tousled her brown hair even more as she crossed the grass, dodging other families and navigating obstacles with the agility of someone well-versed in escaping difficult situations. Mister, wait," she yelled, her childish voice echoing through the park. Edward Ashford stopped, surprised. At 52, the millionaire businessman was not accustomed to being approached by strange children. He turned, a frown on his face, and found a breathless little girl before him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Sophia clasped her hands in supplication, just as she'd seen in the old movies her grandma watched. "Mister, could you be my dad for the school picnic? It'll be real quick, please. I promise I'll be good." Edward felt something stir in his chest. It had been years since he'd felt an emotion so intense and unexpected. The raw vulnerability in the child's eyes awakened something he had buried deep after so many disappointments and losses. "No, I don't understand," he murmured, glancing around as if hoping someone would appear to explain the situation. "Everyone has a dad here but me," Sophia continued, her voice trembling. "I told my teacher mine was coming, but I don't have a dad. I only have my grandma, and she's too sick to leave the house." Edward's orderly, controlled world began to crumble in the face of that innocent confession. He looked at the park filled with happy families, then at the girl's desperate face, and a silent war began inside him. "Wait here for just a minute," he said finally, his voice softer than he intended. Sophia nodded vigorously, hope shining in her eyes. But when Edward got into the car and started the engine, her heart sank. He was leaving. Of course he was. Why would an important man like him waste time on a lying orphan girl? The tears finally escaped as she watched the elegant car disappear around the corner, taking with it her last hope of not being the only child without a family at the picnic. The tears streamed down Sophia's face like tiny rivers of disappointment. She remained frozen in the same spot where the elegant man had left her, watching the point where the car had vanished. The joyful noise of the other children seemed distant, as if from another world, a world where she didn't belong. "Sophia, come join us," Mrs. Miller called, approaching with a sympathetic smile that only intensified the girl's humiliation. "You can sit with me during the picnic." The teacher knew Sophia's story well. She knew about the sick grandmother, the poverty, the innocent lies the child told to feel normal. But knowing didn't make the situation any less painful for either of them. "He said he'd be back," Sophia mumbled, wiping her nose on the sleeve of her faded shirt. "He said to wait just a minute." Mrs. Miller sighed, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Sometimes grown-ups make promises they can't keep, sweetie. Let's go join the other kids." But Sophia shook her head stubbornly. Something inside her refused to give up. Maybe it was the same force that made her invent fantastic stories about having a perfect family. Or maybe it was just the desperation of a child with nothing left to lose. The minutes ticked by slowly. Sophia saw Marcus, a classmate, run into his father's arms after scoring a goal in their makeshift soccer game. She saw Julia being lifted into the air by her mother, spinning and laughing. Each family scene was a cruel reminder of what she didn't have. Then, just as she had lost almost all hope, she heard the familiar sound of an engine. Her heart leaped as she saw the same luxury car returning down the street, stopping in the exact spot it had left. But this time, something was different. Edward got out of the car carrying colorful balloons tied to his hands and a determined expression on his face. The trunk was open, revealing brown paper bags that smelled delicious. He had swapped his formal suit jacket for a more casual dress shirt, as if he'd prepared for a different kind of afternoon. "Sorry for the delay," he said, approaching Sophia with a hesitant smile. "I had to pick up a few things." Sophia couldn't speak. She just stood there, gaping, watching the man who had come back when every other adult in her life had left for good. You came back," she finally whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "I promised I would," Edward replied, surprised by his own sincerity. He had spent the last 15 minutes in a nearby gourmet grocery, buying enough food to feed a small army. He couldn't explain why he'd done it, only that something about that desperate child had touched a part of his soul he thought was dead. Mrs. Miller approached, intrigued. "Sir Edward," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Edward Ashford. I'm Sophia's father." The words came out naturally, as if they were true. Sophia looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe that made him feel like a hero and an imposter all at once. "We're so glad you could make it," the teacher said, clearly relieved. Sophia was so looking forward to it. "Daddy brought balloons," Sophia exclaimed, her voice filled with a genuine joy Edward hadn't heard in a long time. She ran to take the balloons from his hands, and when her small fingers brushed against his, he felt a connection he didn't know was possible. "I also brought a few things to share with Sophia's friends," Edward announced, gesturing toward the car. "And I thought we could make this picnic special for all the kids." Sophia's eyes lit up in a way that completely transformed her face. Suddenly, she was no longer the rejected orphan girl. She was the child with the most generous father in the park, the man who came back when he promised, who brought balloons and food for everyone. Edward had never imagined that organizing a children's picnic could be so complicated and, at the same time, so rewarding. The bags he'd brought contained gourmet sandwiches, fresh fruit, organic juices, and artisanal pastries. A feast that contrasted sharply with the simple snacks the other families had prepared. "Wow, Sophia, your dad is awesome," exclaimed Marcus, running over to the makeshift table Edward had set up. "Look at these cupcakes." Sophia beamed with pride, a completely new feeling for her. For the first time in her life, she was the center of attention for a positive reason. The other children gathered around her, asking questions about her dad and praising his generosity. "Daddy always brings special things," Sophia lied naturally, slipping into character with the ease of someone who had always needed to invent a better reality. He travels a lot for work, so sometimes he can't make it to school events. Edward watched, fascinated, as the girl constructed a complex narrative around him. Each innocent lie was like a piece of a puzzle she was assembling to create the perfect family she had always dreamed of. "Mr. Ashford," Mrs. Miller approached. "It's so kind of you to bring all this for the children. Sophia talks about you so much." He felt a tightness in his chest. She talks about me." "Oh, yes. She tells wonderful stories about the trips you take together, about how you help her with her homework." The teacher smiled, oblivious to the impact of her words. "She's a very imaginative child." Edward looked at Sophia, who was now handing out balloons to her classmates with a radiant smile. The word imaginative echoed in his mind. How many stories had she invented about having a father? How many times had she lied so she wouldn't feel different from the others? "Daddy, can you push us on the swings?" Sophia asked, running up to him with 3 other children in tow. Of course," he replied, surprised by how natural the word "daddy" sounded coming from her. It had been decades since he'd pushed a child on a swing, but he found it was like riding a bike, once learned, never forgotten. As he pushed Sophia gently, she looked back at him with an expression of pure bliss. "You're the best dad in the world," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. Edward felt something break inside him. It wasn't pain, but rather the crumbling of walls he had built over the years. Every push on the swing, every laugh from the girl, every admiring glance was thawing a part of his soul he thought was lost forever. "May I have a word with you?" Mrs. Miller called when the children were busy playing. They stepped aside, and Edward felt a chill in his stomach. Had she figured it out? Was she going to expose the charade in front of everyone? "I want to thank you," the teacher said, surprising him. "Sophia has been through so much. Her grandmother is very ill, and sometimes the little girl comes to school without having had a proper breakfast. Seeing her so happy, it's a gift." "Her grandmother is ill?" Edward asked, genuinely concerned. "Yes, a serious heart condition. Sophia tries to hide it, but we can tell she carries far too much responsibility for a 7-year-old. Mrs. Miller sighed. "She loves you very much, Mr. Ashford. She talks about how you take care of her all the time." Edward looked over at Sophia, who was now organizing a game of Ring Around the Rosie with the other children. She naturally took the lead, including even the shyest kids. There was a maturity in her that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "Daddy, come play with us," she shouted, waving him over. "I'll be right there," he called back, but his mind was in turmoil. Every new piece of information about Sophia's real life made it harder to maintain emotional distance. She wasn't just a needy child asking for a favor. She was an extraordinary girl who deserved so much more than life had given her. The picnic continued with games and laughter, and Edward found himself genuinely enjoying the day. It had been years since he had laughed so much, since he had felt useful in such a simple, direct way. As the sun began to set, he realized he didn't want the day to end. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, families started packing up and saying their goodbyes. Edward watched other children run into their parents' arms, being lifted and kissed, while Sophia quietly helped pick up the balloons that had popped during the afternoon. "The picnic was lovely," Mrs. Miller said, approaching with a satisfied expression. "The children had a wonderful time. Sophia, you have a marvelous father." Sophia smiled, but Edward saw a shadow cross her eyes. Reality was setting in, and with it, the knowledge that this perfect fantasy would have to end. "Daddy," she said shyly, tugging on his sleeve, Can you take me home?" The simple question hit Edward like a punch to the gut. Of course she had to go home. Of course she had a real life, a sick grandmother waiting for her. But somehow, he had allowed himself to forget that this was all temporary. "Of course," he answered, his voice huskier than he intended. "Let's go." The walk to the car was silent. Sophia walked beside him, still clutching 2 balloons that had survived the afternoon, but her energy had visibly drained. It was as if she, too, was bracing herself for the return to reality. "Where to?" Edward asked as they settled into the car, realizing he had no idea where Sophia lived. "Do you know where the Hollows is?" she asked, looking down. Edward knew the name. It was one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, a place he had never set foot in but saw on the news when there were floods or social problems. "I know where it is," he lied, already planning to use his GPS. During the drive, Sophia was quiet, staring out the window. The contrast between the wealthy neighborhood of the picnic and the blighted area they were heading toward was jarring. The houses grew smaller, the streets narrower, the signs of social decay more evident. "You can stop here," Sophia said when they reached the edge of the neighborhood. "Cars can't go any further in." Edward parked and looked around. Children played in the dusty street. Women chatted on the stoops of humble homes. Men returned from work with tired faces. It was a world entirely different from his own. I have to tell you something," Sophia said, her voice barely a whisper. She hadn't gotten out of the car yet, as if gathering her courage. "You can tell me," Edward encouraged, sensing it was important. "I lied," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't have a dad. I never have. My mum left when I was a baby, and I don't even know who my real dad is." Edward felt his heart break. The raw honesty of that confession hit him harder than any business negotiation ever had. "I just wanted to have a family like everyone else," she continued, the words coming out in sobs. "I make up stories about having a dad because it hurts so much to be different. It hurts being the only kid no one picks up from school. No one helps with homework. No one hugs when you're sad." Edward instinctively reached out and touched the girl's shoulder. "Sophia, I know you're not my real dad," she said, looking at him with tear-filled eyes. "I know you were just being nice today because I asked, but it was the best day of my life. For the first time, I knew what it felt like to have someone care." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Edward fought an internal storm that threatened to shatter all the barriers he'd built over the years. "Where do you live exactly?" he asked softly. "Over there," she pointed to a narrow alley, "in the little blue house at the very back. I live with Ms. Connie, but she's not my real grandma. She found me when I was a baby and raised me." Edward looked in the direction she pointed and saw precarious structures, lacking proper sanitation, clearly unfit for dignified living. "Grandma is very sick," Sophia continued. "She can barely get out of bed. I try to take care of her, but sometimes I don't know what to do." The final revelation left Edward speechless. She wasn't just an orphan. She was a child already shouldering the responsibilities of an adult, single-handedly caring for a sick, elderly woman. Edward sat in the car for several minutes after Sophia left, watching her walk down the narrow alley and disappear between the ramshackle buildings. The contrast between the radiant girl from the picnic and the burdened child who had just said goodbye was devastating. He started the car and drove back to his penthouse apartment downtown, but his mind remained in the Hollows. The entire way, he couldn't stop thinking about Sophia's confession, the forced maturity in her words, the responsibility she carried on her small shoulders. His apartment, with its expensive, minimalist decor, felt even emptier than usual. Edward poured himself a whiskey and stood on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere down there, a 7-year-old girl was caring for a sick woman, likely preparing a simple dinner and trying to manage responsibilities that even many adults couldn't handle. In the following days, Edward tried to return to his normal routine: business meetings, major negotiations, multi-million-dollar decisions. But something had changed. His focus was gone. He repeatedly found himself thinking about Sophia, wondering how she was, if she'd eaten properly, if her grandmother's condition had worsened. On Thursday, 3 days after the picnic, he could no longer resist. He cancelled his afternoon meetings and drove to the Hollows. This time, he decided to enter the community on foot, despite the curious glances his suit attracted. The alley where Sophia lived was even more derelict than it had seemed from a distance. Open sewers, makeshift electrical wiring, shacks built one on top of the other without any planning. The smell of damp and poverty was intense, a reality he only knew from TV reports. The blue shack was at the end of the alley, half hidden between two others. It was tiny, with just one window and a peeling wooden door. Edward hesitated before knocking, feeling like an intruder in a world that wasn't his. "Grandma, someone's at the door," he heard Sophia's voice from inside. When the door opened, Sophia's eyes widened in surprise. She was wearing the same clothes from the picnic, now dirty and wrinkled. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and there were dark circles under her childish eyes. "Mr. Edward, what are you doing here?" she asked, a mix of joy and embarrassment in her voice. I wanted to see how you two were doing," he replied, feeling inadequate. "May I come in?" Sophia glanced back, hesitant. "The house is a little messy." "That's okay." She opened the door, and Edward stepped into what was literally a single room, an old bed in the corner where an elderly woman with dark skin and stark white hair lay, a small, old television, a two-burner stove, a few kitchen utensils hanging on the wall. The floor was bare concrete, and the exposed tin roof let in a few drips that Sophia had caught with buckets. "Grandma, this is the Mr. Edward I told you about," Sophia said, approaching the bed. The woman tried to sit up but was clearly weak. "Sorry, I can't get up, mister. My legs are a bit shaky." Edward approached and greeted Miss Connie respectfully. Up close, he could see she was very ill. Her breathing was labored, and her hands trembled slightly. "Sophia told me you were very kind to her at the picnic," the woman said, smiling fondly. "She hasn't talked about anything else for 3 days." "It was a pleasure to meet her," Edward replied, but his attention was split between the conversation and observing the environment. Sophia had set up a small corner where she did her homework, using a plank over 2 bricks as a desk. There were medicines organized on a makeshift shelf, clearly tended by a child's hands. "Mr. Edward, would you like some coffee?" Sophia offered, already heading to the stove. "I know how to make it." "You don't have to worry," he said quickly, but she was already lighting the burner. While Sophia prepared coffee with movements far too practical for her age, Edward talked with Mrs. Connie. He learned that she had worked her whole life as a housekeeper, that she had found Sophia abandoned as a baby in a basket on a church doorstep, and that her health had deteriorated rapidly in recent months. "She's a special girl," Miss Connie said, looking proudly at Sophia. "She takes better care of me than most adults would. But I worry, if something happens to me, she'll be all alone in the world." Edward drank the coffee Sophia had made, surprised by its taste. Despite the simple utensils, she had managed to brew a cup better than many he'd had in expensive restaurants. The girl sat on the floor beside her grandmother's bed, and he realized there weren't enough chairs for everyone. "Sophia, tell me about your day," he asked, genuinely interested. The girl looked at Mrs. Connie, as if asking for permission. When her grandmother nodded, she began to describe a routine that broke Edward's heart. "I wake up at 5 in the morning to give Grandma her medicine and make her some oatmeal," Sophia explained matter-of-factly. "Then I get ready for school, but first I leave water and crackers by her bed so she doesn't get sick while I'm gone." Edward listened in silence, trying to imagine a 7-year-old taking on responsibilities he himself would find challenging. "When I get back from school, I go to the pharmacy to pick up the prescriptions the doctor ordered. Then I make food for both of us. Grandma taught me some easy recipes, but sometimes I burn the beans," she laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "And your homework?" Edward asked. "I do it at night, after Grandma falls asleep. I use a candle when the power goes out, because sometimes they shut it off." Ms. Connie sighed heavily. "I try to help her with her studies, but my eyesight isn't good, and I get tired so quickly." Edward looked around again, noticing details he'd missed at first. The medicines on the shelf were numerous and expensive. Sophia had organized a system with handwritten schedules taped to the wall. There was even a calendar where she marked the days her grandmother felt better or worse. Sophia is a very responsible child, Ms. Connie said with pride, but Edward could see the sadness behind the words. And sometimes I think she grew up too fast because of me. It's not your fault, Grandma, Sophia protested immediately. You saved me when I was a baby. Now it's my turn to take care of you. The maturity of that statement moved Edward deeply. He thought of his own privileged childhood, where his biggest worry was which toy he'd get for his birthday. May I ask about expenses? How do you two get by? Edward asked delicately. Mrs. Connie explained that she received a small pension, but most of it went to medicine. Sophia added that she sometimes helped neighbors with small chores, sweeping a yard, fetching bread from the store, in exchange for a few dollars. But I like to help, Sophia said quickly. Mrs. Maria gives me $5 to take her clothes to the laundromat, and Mr. John gives me $2 to walk his dog. Edward did some mental math. What Sophia earned in a month of work, he spent on a single business lunch. The discrepancy was so vast it was absurd. Mr. Edward, Sophia said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you going to come back again, or was it just because you felt sorry for us? The direct question caught Edward off guard. He looked into those childish eyes that had already seen too much disappointment, and he realized his answer would carry enormous weight. Look, I don't feel sorry for you, he said honestly. I feel admiration. You two are stronger and braver than most people I know. Sophia smiled, but she was still waiting for an answer to her main question. And yes, Edward continued, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I will be back, if you'll have me, of course. Sophia's face lit up in a way that made Edward understand he had just made a commitment far more serious than he had imagined. Ms. Connie looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and caution, like someone who had seen promises broken before. When Edward said his goodbyes and returned to his car, he knew his life had changed irrevocably. It was no longer possible to ignore the reality he had discovered, nor to pretend that Sophia was just another needy child. She had become his responsibility, even if he didn't yet know exactly what that meant. A week had passed since his visit to Sophia's home, and Edward found himself in a situation he had never imagined, sitting in a public elementary school classroom, waiting for a parent-teacher conference. His hands were sweating slightly as he watched other parents chat animatedly about their children's progress. Sophia had asked him, with those pleading eyes he could no longer resist, to attend as her father for the quarterly meeting. All the other dads will be there, Mr. Edward. I promised my teacher you'd come this time, she had said, and he hadn't had the heart to refuse. Now, wearing a less formal suit than usual, Edward felt completely out of place. The other families seemed to know one another, sharing stories and common concerns about their children. He was clearly a stranger in this environment. Mr. Ashford, Mrs. Miller approached with a warm smile. How wonderful to see you here. Sophia was so excited to know you were coming. Thank you for having me, Edward replied, trying to sound natural. The meeting began with Mrs. Miller presenting the class's overall progress. Sophia was among the top students, despite all the difficulties at home. Edward felt a surprising pang of pride. Now, let's talk individually about each child, the teacher announced. Mr. Ashford, shall we start with Sophia? They moved to a table in the corner of the room, and Edward felt all eyes following him. There was something different in the way the other parents watched him, a curiosity that made him uncomfortable. Sophia is an exceptional student, Mrs. Miller began, very mature for her age, responsible, always helping her classmates, but I do have some concerns. What kind of concerns? Edward asked, genuinely interested. She sometimes comes to school very tired, practically falling asleep on her feet, you know. And I've noticed she's missed a few school field trips because she didn't have the fee money. It saddens me because she never complains." Edward felt a lump in his throat. I wasn't aware of these trips. They're small things. Visits to museums, the zoo, but they're very important to the children." Mrs. Miller studied him carefully. "Mr. Ashford, may I ask a personal question?" "Of course. Sophia talks a lot about you, but, well, I've known her for 3 years, and I'd never seen you before the picnic. She used to say she didn't have a father." Edward's blood ran cold. The question he'd been dreading had arrived, and he wasn't prepared for it. We had some personal issues," he improvised. "I was away for a while, working out of town, but I'm trying to make up for lost time now." Mrs. Miller nodded, but Edward could tell she wasn't completely convinced. "I see. It's just that a few of the mothers have commented that you don't seem very, how can I put this, familiar with Sophia's school routine." Before Edward could respond, one of the mothers approached the table. "Sorry to interrupt, but I'm Carla, Marcus's mom. My son won't stop talking about the picnic you organized." "It was my pleasure," Edward replied, relieved by the interruption. "May I ask what you do for a living?" "Marcus said you have a very nice car." The simple question made Edward realize how naive he'd been to think he could maintain the charade without raising suspicion. His clothes, his car, his manner of speaking, everything indicated he came from a very different world. "I'm in business," he answered vaguely. "What kind of business?" Another mother joined the conversation. "We're just curious. Sophia has always been such a private child about her family. And then suddenly a father who's so, successful appears." Edward felt the walls closing in. Every question was a trap. Every vague answer only deepened the suspicion. He could see in the women's eyes that they were connecting pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit. "You know where Sophia lives, don't you?" one of the mothers asked directly. "In the Hollows. It's strange, because you clearly have the financial means, yet you let your daughter live in those conditions." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward realized he had reached the moment he feared most. His lie was about to be publicly exposed. Edward felt a cold sweat run down his back as he faced the mother's inquisitive stares. The question about Sophia living in the Hollows hung in the air like a silent accusation. He needed an answer, and fast. "The situation is complicated," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "Sophia lives with her grandmother because of, well, family matters. We're working on resolving it." The women exchanged glances, clearly unsatisfied with the evasive answer. Mrs. Miller intervened diplomatically. "Well, the important thing is that Sophia is being well cared for now, Mr. Ashford. Shall we discuss the school supplies for the next semester?" Edward seized the change of subject to compose himself. But he knew he had planted a seed of suspicion that would grow quickly. For the rest of the meeting, he felt the whispers and stares directed at him. When the conference ended, Edward headed quickly for the parking lot, but he was intercepted by 3 mothers who had clearly organized to confront him. "Mr. Ashford, could we have a word?" said Carla, the group's unofficial leader. "Of course," he replied, though every fiber of his being screamed for him to run. "Look, we don't want to get into anyone's business," another mother began, "but we've known Sophia for years. She always said she didn't have a father, and then you show up, clearly with a lot of money, but you let the girl live in terrible conditions. Either you don't care about your daughter," Carla added, "or you're not who you say you are." Edward felt the world spin. "I can explain." "Then explain," the third mother said, crossing her arms. "Because none of this makes any sense." Before Edward could answer, a childish voice cut through the tension. "Daddy!" Sophia was running toward them, a radiant smile on her face. She had waited in the schoolyard to meet him after the meeting. "How was the meeting? Did Mrs. Miller say nice things about me?" she asked, clinging to Edward's leg naturally. The mothers watched the interaction with analytical eyes. Edward could see they were looking for signs of falsehood in the relationship between him and Sophia. "It was very good," Edward replied, his voice tighter than he would have liked. "Mrs. Miller said you're an excellent student." Sophia beamed with pride. "Daddy, can you take me for ice cream? You promised if I got a good grade in math." Edward realized Sophia was improvising, creating a story that had never existed. She was trying to make their relationship more convincing, unaware that she was only complicating the situation further. "Of course, honey," he said, playing along. "Sophia," Carla bent down to the girl's level. "How long has your dad been back home?" The question caught Sophia off guard. Edward saw the confusion flash in her eyes before she tried to answer. For a while now," she said hesitantly. "And where did you live before?" "When you were all together?" another mother asked. Sophia looked at Edward in a panic. She didn't know what story to invent, because she didn't know the details of the lie he had told. We lived," she began, but her voice trailed off. Edward knew he had to intervene before the situation got even worse. "Sophia, let's go. Your grandmother is waiting for you at home." "That's right," one of the mothers said slowly. "The grandmother, the one who's actually taking care of her." Edward took Sophia by the hand, trying to move away from the group, but Carla wasn't finished. "Mr. Ashford, we're going to be keeping an eye on this situation. If something is wrong, we'll go to the proper authorities." "There's nothing wrong," Edward said, his voice firmer than he felt. "We hope not," Carla replied, "because if a strange man is taking advantage of a vulnerable child, we're going to find out." Sophia squeezed Edward's hand tighter, sensing the tension in the air, even without fully understanding what was happening. When they finally reached the car, Sophia asked, "Daddy, why were those ladies asking weird questions?" Edward glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the three women still standing in the parking lot, watching them leave. They were already taking pictures of his license plate with their phones. "Don't you worry about that," he told Sophia. But he knew he had just started a war he didn't know how to win. 3 days after the disastrous school meeting, Edward was in his office when his secretary knocked on the door with a worried expression. "Mr. Ashford, there are 2 women from social services here to see you. They say it's about a minor named Sophia." Edward's blood ran cold. He had spent the last few nights sleepless, wondering when the consequences of the meeting would catch up to him. Now they were here, in the form of 2 government employees carrying folders and serious expressions. "Mr. Edward Ashford?" asked the older of the 2, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and glasses. "I'm Martha Santos, a social worker. This is my colleague, Julia Fisher. May we have a word?" "Of course. Please sit," Edward said, trying to maintain his professional composure. "Oh, we've received some concerning reports about your relationship with the minor, Sophia," Martha began, consulting her notes. "It's alleged that you present yourself as the child's father, but that this relationship is questionable." Edward's heart pounded. "What kind of reports?" "Conflicting information about your relationship with the child," Julia explained. "Parents at the school reported that Sophia always said she had no father, and that you appeared in her life recently with no plausible explanation. We were also informed of the discrepancy between your apparent financial situation and the child's living conditions," Martha added. "Sophia lives in extreme poverty in the Hollows, while you clearly possess significant resources." Edward took a deep breath. The moment he had dreaded had arrived. He had to explain a situation that he himself didn't know how to explain. The situation is complicated," he began, using the same evasive phrase from the school meeting. "Mr. Ashford," Martha interrupted gently but firmly, "we need clear answers. Are you the biological father of Sophia?" The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Edward looked at the 2 women, saw the sincere concern in their eyes, and realized there was no easy way out. "No," he said finally. "I am not her biological father." The social workers exchanged a meaningful glance. "Then "What exactly is your relationship with the child?" Julia asked. Edward told the story from the beginning. The meeting in the park, Sophia's desperate plea, his impulsive decision to help her. He spoke of his visit to her home, the sick grandmother, and how he had become emotionally involved in the situation. "Don't I understand your intentions may have been good," Martha said when he finished, "but do you comprehend the gravity of the situation? You are posing as a minor's father, creating emotional bonds that could be detrimental to her." "Sophia needs help," Edward said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "Her grandmother is very ill. They live in terrible conditions. I just wanted to—" "What you wanted doesn't matter," Julia cut in. "What matters is the child's well-being, and a relationship based on lies is not healthy for her." "We will need to visit Sophia and speak with her," Martha announced. "And we will also need to assess whether Ms. Connie is fit to continue caring for her." Edward felt a surge of panic. "What does that mean?" "It means that if we determine the child is at risk or neglected, we will have to take protective measures," Julia explained. "That could include temporary or permanent removal from the current home." "You're going to take her from her grandmother?" Edward asked, horrified. "If necessary, yes, there are procedures that must be followed to protect vulnerable minors." Edward thought of Sophia, of how she lovingly cared for Miss Connie, of how devastating the separation would be for both of them. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "Any way to help officially?" "You could apply to be a foster parent," Martha suggested, "but that involves a long process of psychological, social, and financial evaluation. And even then, there are no guarantees." "How long would that process take?" "Months, maybe more than a year." Edward saw the cruel trap of the situation. To help Sophia officially, he needed time she might not have, but continuing the charade would only make things worse for everyone. "Mr. Ashford," Martha said, standing up, "I strongly advise you to distance yourself from the child until this situation is resolved. Your presence is complicating an already delicate case." When the social workers left, Edward was alone in his office, feeling the weight of reality crash down on him. His attempt to help had turned into a threat to Sophia's well-being, and now, when she needed him most, he was being forced to disappear from her life. Edward tried to stay away as the social workers had advised, but 3 days later, he received a call that changed everything. It was Mrs. Miller, Sophia's teacher, her voice trembling with worry. "Mr. Ashford, I know I probably shouldn't be calling, but Sophia didn't come to school today. When I went to check, I found out that Miss Connie was rushed to the hospital last night." Edward felt the world spin. "And Sophia? She's at the hospital, alone. She has no one but her grandmother, and the doctor said Miss Connie is in serious condition. Sophia won't leave her side." "Which hospital?" Edward asked, already grabbing his car keys. "Southside General Hospital, but Mr. Ashford, Social Services has been notified. They're on their way to pick Sophia up and take her to a temporary shelter." Edward drove like a madman through the city streets. His mind raced with possibilities, all of them bad. Sophia losing the only family she'd ever known, being taken to a strange place, surrounded by strangers who didn't understand her story. When he arrived at the hospital, he found Sophia sitting on a plastic chair in the hallway, small and lost amidst the bustle of doctors and nurses. She was wearing the same clothes from the day before, and her eyes were red from crying. "Mr. Edward!" she cried when she saw him, running into his arms. "Grandma is really sick. The doctors won't let me stay with her all the time." Edward hugged her tightly, feeling her small body tremble with fear and exhaustion. "Where is she?" "In the ICU. They said her heart stopped working right." Sophia clung to his shirt. "I don't want her to die. I don't want to be alone." A doctor approached, identifying himself as Dr. Roberts. "Sir, are you related to the patient?" Edward hesitated for a second before answering. "I'm a friend of the family." "How is she?" "Myocardial infarction. We've stabilized her, but her condition is critical. Her advanced age and pre-existing health issues complicate the prognosis. Is she going to be okay? Sophia asked, her voice small and scared. The doctor knelt to her level. We're doing everything we can, sweetie, but it's going to take time. Doctor, Edward said, this girl has no one else. If something happens to her grandmother, we've already contacted social services, the doctor replied. A social worker should be here any moment to speak with the child. Edward felt panic take over. The same women who had warned him to stay away were now coming to get Sophia. Mr. Edward, Sophia tugged his sleeve, you won't let them take me away, will you? I promise I'll be good. I won't be any trouble. Before Edward could answer, two familiar figures appeared at the end of the hallway. Martha and Julia, the social workers, were walking toward them with determined steps. Sophia, Martha said gently, you need to come with us. We're going to a place where you'll be well cared for while your grandmother recovers. I don't want to go. Sophia hid behind Edward. I want to stay here with my grandma. That's not possible, honey, Julia explained patiently. Our children can't stay at the hospital alone. She's not alone, Edward said, surprising himself. She's with me. The social workers exchanged a look. Mr. Ashford, we've already discussed this. You have no legal authority to keep her. Then give me authority, he said, his voice gaining strength. Do whatever is necessary. It doesn't work like that, Martha explained. There are processes, evaluations, and while you're doing your evaluations, where will Sophia be? In a shelter with strangers, away from the only family she's ever known? Sophia started to cry, clinging to Edward's leg. Please don't take me away. I only have him and Grandma. The scene in the hospital corridor was drawing attention. Other visitors were stopping to watch, and Edward knew that every second of the social worker's hesitation was an opportunity. Can you evaluate me while she stays with me temporarily? He asked. At least until we know her grandmother's condition. It's irregular, Julia muttered, but not impossible, Martha said thoughtfully. It could be a case for emergency temporary custody, considering the exceptional circumstances. Edward held his breath. Sophia stopped crying and looked at the social workers with hope. It would have to be supervised, Martha continued. Regular visits, reports, psychological evaluations. I accept any and all conditions, Edward said immediately. And if we determine it's not a suitable arrangement, the child will be removed immediately. I understand, Martha sighed. I'll make some calls, but Mr. Ashford, this is only temporary, and any irregularity, there won't be any, Edward promised, knowing he had just taken on the most important responsibility of his life. Sophia's first night in Edward's apartment was an eye-opener for them both. She stood in the living room, turning slowly to take in the vastness of the space, which was larger than the entire shack where she lived with Ms. Connie. This is where you live, she asked, her voice echoing in the minimalist environment. Alone, alone, Edward confirmed, realizing for the first time how devoid of life his apartment was, filled only with expensive, soulless objects. Sophia walked over to the panoramic window that overlooked the entire city. Can you see our house from up here? Edward joined her at the window, and together they looked for the hollows in the distant urban landscape. There, he pointed to a darker area on the outskirts. I think it's over there. My grandma always said rich people lived in the clouds, Sophia murmured. Now I see why. Over the next week, Edward's life was turned upside down. His rigid routine of meetings and business had to accommodate Sophia's school schedule, visits to the hospital to see Miss Connie, and constant supervision from the social workers. The first morning, Edward discovered he didn't know how to make a proper breakfast for a child. Sophia, sensing his struggle, gently taught him how to make oatmeal. "Grandma taught me," she explained, stirring the pot with a competence that broke Edward's heart. "You add cinnamon and sugar. It makes it taste better." The supervised hospital visits were emotionally taxing. Mrs. Connie was conscious but very frail. She would hold Sophia's hand through the bed rails, whispering words of love and concern. "Take good care of her," Mrs. Connie said to Edward during one visit. "She's special. She deserves a chance to be a kid," Edward promised, not yet knowing that keeping that promise would fundamentally change who he was. Sophia transformed the silent apartment into a vibrant home. Her homework spread across the dining table, her drawings taped to the refrigerator, her laughter echoing through the hallways. It all brought an energy Edward didn't know his life was missing. "Why don't you have any family pictures?" Sophia asked one day, exploring the empty rooms. "I don't have a family," Edward admitted. "Everyone has a family. Don't you have a mom and dad? They passed away when I was young, and I never married or had children." Sophia processed this information with the seriousness of someone much older. "So you were lonely, just like me." "I was," Edward said, realizing he was using the past tense for the first time. "But now we're not lonely anymore," she concluded with the simple logic of childhood. The psychological and social evaluations were intense. Edward had to endure hours of interviews, personality tests, and background checks. Sophia was also evaluated, and the psychologists were impressed by her maturity and resilience. "The child demonstrates a healthy attachment," the psychologist reported to the social workers. "Despite the unusual circumstances of the relationship, she feels safe and protected." Edward also had to learn practical skills he had never considered. How to help with homework, how to recognize when Sophia was sad but trying to hide it, how to balance discipline with affection. "Mr. Edward," Sophia said one night as he was tucking her into bed, "do you think Grandma is going to get better?" The direct question caught him off guard. The doctors had been cautious about the prognosis, speaking of a slow recovery and possible complications. "I think she's fighting very hard to come back to you," he said honestly. And if she can't?" Edward sat on the edge of the bed he had bought for her, the first purchase he'd made with someone else in mind in years. "Then we'll take care of each other," he said, surprising himself with how naturally the words came. Sophia smiled, but Edward saw tears in her eyes. "You promise you won't leave me, even if it gets hard?" Edward looked at the brave little girl who had changed his life in a few short weeks, who had taught him about unconditional love without even realizing it. "I promise," he said, and for the first time in his life, a personal promise meant more to him than any business contract. The call came on a Thursday morning, as Edward was helping Sophia get ready for school. The phone rang insistently, and Dr. Roberts' voice on the other end was grave and urgent. "Mr. Ashford, you need to come to the hospital immediately. Ms. Connie went into cardiac arrest during the night. We were able to resuscitate her, but her condition is critical." Edward looked at Sophia, who was brushing her teeth in the bathroom, humming a children's song. How could he tell her that the only family she had ever known might be dying? "Sophia," he called gently, "we need to go to the hospital. Your grandma isn't feeling well." The smile vanished from the girl's face instantly. "Is she dying?" she asked with the brutal frankness of childhood. Edward knelt to her level. "She's very, very sick. The doctors are doing everything they can." At the hospital, the scene was devastating. Ms. Connie was connected to several machines, her breathing maintained artificially. Sophia approached the bed slowly, as if afraid of breaking something. "Grandma, it's me, Sophia. Can you hear me?" she whispered, holding the frail woman's hand. "Doctor." Roberts pulled Edward aside. "Her condition is irreversible. It's a matter of hours, maybe less. You should prepare yourselves." Edward felt a crushing weight on his chest. It wasn't just the impending loss of Mrs. Connie, but the realization that Sophia would lose the last connection to her old life, to her identity. "Doctor," he said, "the girl, she has no one else but this woman. If something happens, social services has been notified. They'll want to discuss the next steps." As if summoned, Martha and Julia appeared in the hallway. Their expressions were a mixture of professionalism and compassion. "Mr. Ashford," Martha said, "we need to discuss Sophia's situation. With the likely passing of Miss Connie, the emergency temporary custody will come to an end." "What does that mean?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "It means Sophia will need to be placed in a permanent foster home or returned to Child Protective Services until a suitable family is found." Edward looked at Sophia, who was whispering stories to Mrs. Connie, trying to wake her with the same fantasies she had always invented to make life more bearable. "What if I want to adopt her officially?" he asked. "The process can take over a year," Julia explained. "There are extensive evaluations, a supervised adjustment period, judicial approval, and there's no guarantee of approval. A year where she would be, where? In foster homes or group homes." Edward imagined Sophia being taken from him, placed with strangers who didn't know her history, her strength, her sweetness. The thought was unbearable. "Is there any way to expedite the process?" "Only in very special circumstances," Martha said hesitantly. "What kind of circumstances?" Before she could answer, Sophia ran toward them, tears streaming down her face. "She woke up! Grandma woke up!" They all rushed into the room. Ms. Connie had opened her eyes and was looking directly at Sophia, a faint but genuine smile on her lips. "My girl," she whispered with difficulty, "come here." Sophia drew near, and Miss Connie made a tremendous effort to speak. You have to be a good girl. Study, grow up, be happy." "Grandma, don't talk like that. You're going to get better," Sophia protested. Ms. Connie looked at Edward over Sophia's head. "Take care of her, please. She deserves a real family." "I promise," Edward said, his voice breaking. Ms. Connie smiled and closed her eyes. The machines began to beep frantically. Nurses rushed into the room, but Edward already knew it was too late. Sophia didn't immediately understand what was happening. Only when the doctors stopped trying to revive her and covered Miss Connie with a white sheet did she understand. The scream that escaped her echoed through the hospital corridors. It was the sound of a child losing the last connection to her life, her identity, everything she had ever known as family. Edward scooped her into his arms as she sobbed desperately. "She's gone. Grandma's gone, and now I have no one." Over Sophia's head, Edward saw the social workers exchange a somber, professional look. Time was up. From that moment on, Sophia was officially an orphan, a ward of the state, and he was just a well-intentioned stranger with no legal rights to her. The biggest fight of his life was just beginning. The days following Ms. Connie's death were an emotional roller coaster. Sophia barely spoke, just clung to Edward as if he were her only anchor in a world that had completely fallen apart. The social workers gave them a week for grieving before making any final decisions about the girl's future. Edward used every minute of that week to research, hire lawyers specializing in family law, and mobilize every possible resource. His secretary was stunned to see him cancel major meetings to chase down documents and authorizations. "Mr. Ashford," his lawyer, Mr. Davis, said during an urgent consultation, "the adoption process will be long and complex, and there's an additional problem: your age." "My age? I'm 52. "Exactly. Sophia is 7. The courts and agencies generally prefer a smaller age gap. It's a significant hurdle we'll have to overcome." Edward felt the floor drop out from under him. "So it's impossible." "Not impossible, but much more difficult. We'll need strong, favorable recommendations from the psychologists, the social workers, and a very compelling case for the judge. And if I don't succeed, Sophia will be placed in the foster care system." That night, Edward talked to Sophia about the possibility of her having to live with other people temporarily. "I don't want to live with strangers," she said, holding on to him tighter. "I want to stay with you. You're my family now." "Sophia, I am going to fight for you, but it might take some time to sort things out legally." "How long?" Edward didn't know how to answer. It could be months, maybe years. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following week. Edward prepared for it like he had never prepared for any business presentation. He gathered letters of recommendation, psychological reports, financial statements, anything that could prove he would be a suitable father for Sophia. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse was busy. Besides Edward, Sophia, the social workers, and the lawyers, several people from Sophia's school were present, including Mrs. Miller, who had written a moving letter about the positive transformation she had witnessed in the girl. The judge, Judge Thompson, was a man in his 60s with a reputation for being strict but fair in cases involving minors. "This is an unusual case," he began, leafing through the documents. "Mr. Ashford, do you understand the gravity of what you are asking?" "I do, Your Honor. Sophia isn't just a responsibility to me. She has become my daughter. Even knowing there are no biological ties, that you've known each other for only a few weeks. Sometimes, Your Honor, family isn't defined by blood, but by love and care." The judge turned to Sophia. "Sophia, can you tell me how you feel about living with Mr. Ashford?" Sophia stood up, small but brave in the face of all the formality. "He takes care of me like nobody ever has. He helps me with my homework. He makes yummy food. And he always hugs me when I'm sad because I miss my grandma. And you would like to continue living with him?" "Yes, he's my dad now, not in my tummy, but in my heart." The simple, honest answer echoed in the silent courtroom. Martha Santos, the social worker, was called to testify. "Your Honor, we initially had reservations about this situation. But after weeks of observation and evaluation, I can state that I have never seen a child adapt so well and develop so positively in such a short time." Mrs. Miller, the teacher, also testified. "Sophia was a burdened child who hid her pain behind forced smiles. Today, she is a genuinely happy little girl." The psychologist who had evaluated them both presented his report. "The bond between them is genuine and healthy. Mr. Ashford has demonstrated an exceptional ability to adapt to a child's needs, and Sophia has found in him the emotional stability she has always needed." After hearing all the testimony, the judge retired to his chambers to deliberate. The 20 minutes of waiting felt like an eternity. When he returned, his expression was solemn. "This case challenges many legal conventions. The age difference, the lack of biological ties, the relatively short time of acquaintance, all of this would suggest caution." Edward held Sophia's hand, bracing for the worst. "However," the judge continued, "the law exists to protect the best interest of the child, and all the evidence indicates that Sophia's best interest is to remain with Mr. Ashford." Sophia cried out with joy and threw herself into Edward's arms. He lifted her up, tears streaming down his face, a sense of relief and happiness he had never experienced in his life. "And I hereby grant permanent custody of Sophia to Edward Ashford," the judge announced officially. "May this unconventional family be an example that true love transcends all barriers." 8 months after the court hearing, Edward parked the car in the same spot at Lincoln Park, where it all began. This time, it wasn't a school picnic day, but a sunny spring Saturday that Sophia had chosen for a special celebration. "We're here," Sophia announced cheerfully, hopping out of the car with the energy of a truly happy child. She wore a new dress, her hair was neatly combed, and her eyes shone with a light that hadn't been there months ago. Edward followed, carrying a picnic basket they had packed together in their kitchen at home. The word home still moved him. His apartment had been completely transformed, filled with drawings on the walls, children's books scattered about, plants Sophia insisted on caring for, and the constant sound of laughter. "Dad," Sophia said, naturally using the word that had taken weeks to come easily, "do you remember where I found you?" Edward smiled. "How could I forget? Right over there by those trees." They walked to the exact spot where a desperate little girl had begged a stranger to be her father for a few hours. Now, 8 months later, that same girl was legally his daughter, and he couldn't imagine his life without her. "You know what I was thinking that day?" Sophia asked, spreading the blanket on the grass. "What?" "I was making up a story about what it would be like to have a real dad, and you showed up looking exactly like I had imagined, elegant, kind, and with a sort of sad smile that I wanted to make happy." Edward sat beside her, moved by the girl's perception. "And you succeeded in making my smile happy." "We succeeded," Sophia corrected. "Because I didn't know how to really smile either before you." As they set up their picnic, other families arrived at the park. Edward watched fathers pushing their kids on the swings, mothers chasing toddlers, grandparents telling stories under the trees. He now fully understood that sense of belonging he had always observed from a distance. "Dad, look who's here." Sophia pointed to a group of familiar kids. It was some of her classmates. Accompanied by their families, Sophia waved enthusiastically, and they were soon invited to join a makeshift soccer game. Edward watched his daughter run across the field with other children, shouting with joy when she scored a goal, being comforted by friends when she lost the ball. She had become a normal kid with normal kid worries, no longer burdened with adult responsibilities. "Mr. Ashford," Mrs. Miller approached with a warm smile. "What a surprise to see you here, Mrs. Miller. Sophia chose this place for our celebration." Celebration. "It's been exactly 8 months since we met in this park," Edward explained. "Sophia insisted it was a special anniversary." The teacher smiled and watching Sophia play. "She really has changed so much. She's a completely different girl, more confident, more spontaneous. You've worked miracles." "Actually, she's the one who worked the miracle," Edward replied. "She taught me that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in who you love and who loves you back." When Sophia came running back, flushed and sweaty from the game, she threw herself into Edward's arms. "Dad, did you see how I played?" "I did, champ. You were amazing." Sophia snuggled up beside him on the blanket, and they watched the other families in comfortable silence. "Dad," she said after a while, "do you remember the promise Grandma Connie made you make?" Edward nodded. How could he forget Ms. Connie's last words, asking him to take care of Sophia and give her a real family? "I think you kept it," Sophia said seriously. "Grandma would be very proud to see how we became a family." Edward hugged his daughter tighter, feeling an immense gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. From a lonely businessman and an orphan girl, they had become father and daughter, a family built not by the chance of genetics, but by the conscious choice to love and care for one another. "You know, Sophia," he said, "I have a confession to make too." "What is it?" "That first day, when you asked me to be your dad, I was scared. Scared I wouldn't know how to take care of you. Scared I would mess everything up. And now," Edward looked at his daughter, at the park full of happy families, at the life they had built together. "Now I know that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose to have, not the ones we're born into. And I choose you every day, Sophia, forever." Sophia smiled. That genuine, radiant smile that had forever replaced the forced smiles of the past. "I choose you too, Dad, always." And there, in the same park where a desperate lie had planted the seed of a true love, a father and daughter celebrated not just the anniversary of their first meeting, but the birth of a family that proved the most beautiful miracles happen when we least expect them.